Students, and welcome to today's lecture with me, Professor William Wright. Sorry, I'm just hitting my timer. Today we're going over chapter 19 of Living with Art by Mark Getlein. This is another chapter that's kind of like the non-European, non-like Western civilization through line that a lot of our history covers. We're actually still kind of hitting some areas outside of that main through line. And today the focus is on the art of Asia, including India, China, and Japan. That kind of gets us a few focal points to work on. This is going to be part one. I'm sure there will be two videos. Today we're start there. Last time we covered chapter 18, which was the art of Islam and Africa, and before that we covered the ancient arts of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. We kind of started here, worked across like around the Mediterranean and partially through Europe in terms of through ancient times in BC, and then we got kind of went back to Mesopotamia for talking about the history of Islam and parts of or the Arabian world, and then of course we talked about Africa, and we're kind of jumping back and forth on the timeline, but covering different areas. And then today we're going to continue to move eastward. We're going to go from west to east. So we're going to start with India today, and then we're going to cover China and Japan in the chapter 19 slides. Now, that said, we're unfortunately we could spend so much time, talking about we could get into Vietnam, we could get into Korea, we could get into the Pacific Islands. We'll get a little bit into the Pacific Islands, but we don't even hit the major like Indonesian cultures and things like that. So this is like once again super duper skipping a stone, just given the most basic, most obvious, but still, like I said, wanting to go outside of just the Eurocentric look at things and look at some other arts of the world. So in any case, we're jumping over to Asia. Here's a map of kind of all the things we're going to cover today. There'll be more than this, but this is a map from our textbook that kind of shows you the layout of India and then China and then Japan, and of course Korea is sort of in between. Mongolia is up here above China, and you can see the Arabian world's over here. We got Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran as we head. If you were to go that way, that's like kind of into Persia and stuff. But in any case, a lot of the great art that we're going to see is kind of listed here on the map. If you wanted to hit pause and kind of look through the things we're going to talk about. Now, we're not going to talk about everything even actually on here, but a lot of it will be covered. We have some early artworks, including cave paintings and other things that start in India, and sort of some of the earliest artworks of this area of Asia. Now, keep in mind, I've been saying the last few chapters that we've been talking about the Eurasian continent, and Eurasia is literally is basically another word for that piece of land that goes all the way from like France and most of Europe all the way over to China, kind of excluding Japan. So we're still kind of technically on that Eurasian continent, but we're just kind of focusing on the eastern portion. And in doing that, we're going to go ahead and start with India. So let me jump in. The earliest cities in India arose on the Indus River Valley. The Indus Valley civilizations kind of begin this. This is basically an area that kind of follows the border of India and Pakistan, and includes areas of Kashmir and things like that. And like I said, Afghanistan is not far from here. Central Asia, the Eurasian steppes, where the Mongols are from. But in any case, around 2600 BC, we know there are established societies. Before the Neolithic period, there were forced hunter-gatherers, and then as we got through the Neolithic, they had Stone Age farmers and cattle herders, and hunter-gatherer people were also scattered across the southern portion. So there were different groups, but the first like settled societies all like tends to happen. We talked about Egypt is kind of centered on a river. China, we're going to see, is centered on a river. Lots of civilizations, when they start to settle on a river, for the purpose of domestication and agriculture. But in any case, the Indus Valley is again where we see some of the earliest sort of art goods. Now, of course, as is always, there's lots of art developing in other places that may be different. This might not even be the most important art. There may be other things that were there before that were better established, but this is the earliest stuff we know about. Now, they did not believe in grave goods, which means there's not a lot of stuff that was kept. Most of it was sort of just, the goods that a person had were just sort of moved on to through the family or thrown away or whatever. But so they didn't have, as far as we understand, many grave goods. So what we have a limited array of goods from before the time of the Indus River Valley. But the first things that we do have, besides cave paintings in ancient central India, we also had stone sculptures that remain from the Mohenjo-daro, which is the oldest city in that region. And we know it was populated back to this, I guess it would be third millennium BC. But in any case, this Mohenjo-daro area is the oldest, and what we have is sort of suggestive of early forms of yoga, early forms of the Hindu god Shiva. So we already know Hindu and yoga practices are sort of taking place, at least in some version. Now, a lot of what we have here looking at this object are seals that would have been made of stone, so that's why they remain, but they actually are not the finished artwork as much as tools used to make art. So this is actually a stone seal, which means it would have been pressed into clay or wax. So again, this is more of like a stamp, not a finished art piece. But you see the bull symbol, obviously some sort of animal veneration, as well as, I think it's worth noting, this has got to be some form of written pictography or written language, almost early forms of it. You can't help but wonder, or when you see those sort of just random small symbols in a row here, that gives an indication of a certain potential writing system. Now, there are other seals, not just the bull seals. There's other seals, again, that kind of give the indication, like I said, of yogi. When we look at this yogi seal from somewhere between 2300 and 1750 BC, it was used to impress wax or clay. The position is obviously informed by some form of meditation, right? So again, this suggestive of yoga practices early. And then, of course, the anthropomorphic features of the god Shiva, either sort of like elephant or water buffalo type figures. And again, more almost like pre-writing symbols, other animal symbols, and those sort of kind of typical of ancient artworks, things that we've seen. Early, human figure sculptures that we see are made of sandstone. There's a variety. Something that's worth mentioning when I see this here is also just the fact that even to this day, there are thousands of subcultures and specific like dialects and things that are happening in India, which means it was probably even more so in ancient times. And so it's worth kind of noting that there's probably not one like monolithic style that was happening in these ancient times, but we do see some rather like simple abstracted human forms that are made out of sandstone. That's some of the earliest like stone sculptures, and we have some that are maybe a little more accurate in terms of anatomy and things like that, although we don't have the complete objects. There's some kind of indication of the study of the human figure going on in early sculptures. But then obviously when we start to have things really come together is going to be as they start to develop more spiritual practices. A lot of times this is one of the things that like helps us line up, or maybe just is a good thing for us to use as a center of our study of art cultures. But Buddhism begins to grow up in India. It is born there. So where it comes from, urban centers grow, and what there's a people group called the Aryans that were previously nomadic societies. They begin to settle and spread out less nomadically, but more like settlement wise by the 8th century BC. Now, real quick, let me cover that term Aryan. Aryan means something different to us now because of the way that Nazi Germany took the term and sort of perverted it and twisted it. That what they were actually using to justify what they did is they were talking about this group of people that would have been, like I said, a nomadic people that lived in Eurasia. And what they are is they're was it Proto-Indo-European speakers. That's what Aryan basically means. Aryan was a much better word for Proto-Indo-European speakers, but what they essentially were is the people groups that the basically all of the languages from Europe to the Mediterranean to India to China kind of come from this specific group of people that were nomads that lived above India, between Europe and Asia, and they they spread their cultures, and as they grew all the way across the continent over thousands and thousands of years, we have the cultures that we know now. But there's this idea of a root culture. They were called the Aryans. And for whatever reason, the Nazis really got into this whole deal. But the German, native German people were somehow specifically related back to them, which was pseudoscience and not really a reliable way of thinking of things. But they kind of co-opted that term. And so now we try not to use that term as much as Proto-Indo-European speakers. I still like the word Aryan, and I want to take it back, but that's just me. And get it to be used appropriately and not messed up. But anyway, that's one of those soapboxes I always go too long on. But now you know why you're seeing that word here and what it somewhat means. You can do your own research. I'm sure. Again, I'm not an expert on linguistics. In addition to this, but I know it was essentially the group that began to settle these areas. In any case, Gautama is a figure. He was born in 563 BC, and after a series of specific encounters and experiences trying to figure out spirituality, as far as I understand, he was sort of well off. Life was easy, and he had a lot of trouble in the spiritual realm finding some sort of peace. So he kept looking for things, and then eventually he turns to meditation. Which is a Hindu practice as well, and which would have been common in India, but he begins to have these great successes with meditation in finding some sort of meaning, and he becomes what is known as the Buddha, or awakened to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and he rose above it. He became enlightened, or he reached nirvana. He became knowledgeable to the cycle of life that we live, reincarnation, all those things, in a way that a regular person who hadn't meditated on it couldn't, is the idea. And he becomes a central sort of prophet figure to this group that becomes known as Buddhism, and it rises and spreads throughout India. And then he was laid to rest in the famous Great Stupa, made of 8 memorial mounds in Sanchi, India. Here's the burial, the Great Stupa where the Buddha was buried. He's a historical figure. We know he existed, and he did create this sort of new practice. And I do think it's interesting. It's not entirely different from Hinduism, actually. We see here that the temples are different, their practices are different, but actually, as far as their art goes, is where I'm going to say there's a lot of similarity. There's specific figures and repeated motifs that are kind of shared between the two. We'll talk more about the gods of Hinduism, but as far as I understand, Buddhism actually comes out of Hinduism to a certain extent, which again has been around in some form or fashion and since ancient times. But we see in Hinduism, these are venerated gods who create the universe and run the universe and all this thing, versus in Buddhism, they're just sort of spirit figures, right? That's the idea. And again, not an expert on all these things, but that's in my research that why we see that they're shared, right? They're similar, but they're seen different. It's kind of like some differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's some shared ancient roots, but the modern take on it is different. But in any case, we see some similarities. We see the elephant and animal motifs of Hinduism and just the broader Indian culture here in these Buddhist temples. But from there, after the Buddha dies, there are people known as bodhisattva. They become Buddhist teachers who have also reached nirvana, is the idea. They're like pastors that have reached the same level as Buddha, but they're called bodhisattva. And this is partially part of why a lot of images of the Buddha are so varied and so different. We don't realize that now as kind of Western viewers, but it's not always just that they're different takes on the same guy, but they're actually sometimes different people. And these people are called bodhisattva. But their imagery is a staple of the next millennia and done in many different styles. The Sarnath style is one we see here, rather simple, very symmetrical. it's all about the posture and the hand poses and things like that. And again, we see some of the ancient sort of almost Hindu figures in the background. That's 400 BC, but the same imagery lasts for another 1,000 years, and we still are seeing bodhisattvas in 500 AD. And this particular one on the right is the Gupta style. We see it's a little bit more ornamental headdress, some more naturalistic posing, things like that, not just always the same kind of static, closed-eyed, symmetrical pose. In any case, for that 1,000 years, there's this large focus, like I've said, on Buddhism, but Hinduism, it's always there, right? It's always in the background. It's this basis of what was actually the chosen belief of the Gupta rulers. Although they did support the making of Buddhist art, Hinduism was their chosen belief, right? And we knew that it was around from ancient times, and they start to put it more together. And these Gupta rulers actually start to essentially they espouse, a culture in India that leans more towards Hinduism. And well, again, while Buddhism is still around, Hinduism kind of takes center stage, and Buddhism is shifted towards China. Right, and we'll talk about that later. But Buddhism, it moves to the southeast. Hinduism begins to take over more in India, and Hinduism, so that we cover it, is actually a mixture of many, many belief systems. It's probably this culmination, really, trying to put together, like I said, those thousands of different ancient cultures that are spread across India, trying to create some sort of central focus or create a similarity between them. But as far as I understand it, there's hundreds of gods in Hinduism, or at least dozens, but there's some sort of similarities between most veins of it. Now it's a mixture of all those different belief systems, but they mostly center on Shiva, Shakti, or Vishnu. Now you'll see here we have this image on the right of Shiva in dancing form. She is the destroyer, they are the destroyer of worlds, and this is the principal deity that represents death, right? And the destruction, the end of life, or the afterlife in a sense. And yeah, you can see the figure sort of dancing, posing here. Again, hand symbols and orientation of the body are very important, as well as the repeated motifs. There's always some sort of a crown or like some border around most of the figures. Now, this is the figure of Shiva. Devi, Shakti, or Durga are kind of different names for this, what I consider, and again, I'm just dumbing it down as best I can for the purpose of studying the imagery. Durga is the power goddess. Durga sort of represents life, right? The cycle of actually being alive. So if Shiva is death, Durga is life, and represents abilities and adventures, like has more stories, right? This is an image of Durga fighting the buffalo demon, which, I kind of can't help but notice the similarities with the Minotaur, right, in the past as well. And then, yeah, we see Durga like riding into battle and apparently being victorious over this buffalo demon. And then that's Durga, Devi, or Shakti. They're kind of like the same, like I said. And then Vishnu is the creator of the universe, right? Vishnu dreamt the world into existence and represents life, right? Birth, right? So the Hindus believe in life cycles, as well as the Buddha believed the same thing: birth, life, death, rebirth, right? Karma is a part of all of it. Rebirth, how all that works is sort of similar in ways, although I already outlined the difference. But we see a lot more. The imagery, again, is sort of Hindu in focus. Now, I always like to ask, like, what kind of similarities you see, kind of note between these goddess figures, these deities in it. And the ones I always notice, there's two similarities that I always notice between all three figures. And that is, one, that they always have multiple arms, right? I figure that represents some sort of extra ability over just your regular human with two arms. And then the other thing that you kind of notice is, in most cases, they're sort of androgynous, right? It's sort of hard to tell, is it a man, is it a woman? And this, I think this must not be a coincidence, and there must be some reason to this, especially since they're specifically deity, right? They're representative of other spirits. They're not necessarily representative of specific figures. But in any case, we see these these images repeated, as well as the many dozens, possibly hundreds of other gods on Hindu temples. They become elaborate worship centers that have. I have actually been to a Hindu temple, and it is a pretty impressive sight to see. The imagery is just. It's shocking how much they've got everywhere, and they're typically I would say they're very beautiful and ornate and respectful. They're very quiet places, and again, it's all about the meditation, right? And there are usually very welcoming of outsiders. But yeah, you see these niches they're called mandir, the Hindu temples, and you can see, yeah, it's like every square inch is covered in decoration of these figures, right? And there's many other arts surrounding Hinduism, and again, we could probably spend an entire semester on some of the specific areas of Hindu decoration. But for now, we're going to keep moving on through the timeline, and the Mughals are a Islamo-Mongol group that makes their way to India by the 16th century AD. The Mughals, really what happens is that the Mongols kind of invade the Middle East, like we talked about before. And like I said, a lot of them convert to Islam, and they sort of, some of them stay and they intermix. And there's this Mongol Persian group of people that begins to, like I said, they're descendants of the Mongols. They're sort of reigning after the defeats, the victories of the Mongols, and they spread. It's interesting because they spread westward and then they spread back east towards India. They create an empire in India and set up an Indian form of Islamic art. Now, it is important, though, that the Mughals were technically a religiously open group of people. They actually were a religiously tolerant people, because the rulers of the Mughal knew that if they put their foot down on religious practices, that they would lose a huge part of the population because of the ancient roots of Hinduism. But in any case, this is a several hundred-year-old dynasty or empire that reigns in India and has a lot of success. And especially, this is who the British interact with as they begin to have more interaction with the East. And in any case, one of the most famous structures built in India is actually built by the Mughals, and you can actually see the sort of tracing back towards Islamic architecture in it. And I'm sure by now you've kind of figured out what it is. If you haven't, try to guess, what is the structure? Well, it is actually the Taj Mahal. If you think back to the images we have of the mosques that were built, again, based on the Prophet's house, we see the courtyards, we see the minarets, we see the archways and the dome that actually, comes into the mosque architecture later from Persia, right? But you can actually see, I think when you look at this, you can see the basis of the Mughals, in that ancient kind of Islamic architecture, or older Islamic architecture. Here, if you really look at the Isfahan mosque, the Persian turquoise, they're turquoise there, but the domes are the physical archways and domes are really Persian. The layout is very Islamic in origin, and I think it's a pretty cool way of kind of seeing the multicultural aspect of the Mughals and what's going on there in India. The Taj Mahal is, of course, built as a burial chamber for the wife of Shah Jahan. And his wife. It's a burial chamber of Shah Jahan and his wife. In the year 1631, Mumtaz Mahal was giving birth to their 14th child and died due to some complications of probably the fact that it was the 14th child. But in any case, while she was on her deathbed, Shah Jahan promised her that he would never remarry and would build the richest mausoleum over her grave. So we get this amazing. It's like a pyramid with much more elaborate ornamentation. It's this massive architectural feat, in addition to being a burial chamber for Mumtaz Mahal. So yeah, pretty impressive feat we see there, and that kind of. I hate to say this, but that's going to kind of end our focus on India in terms of its art. Now I'm going to hit pause just real quick to double check things. Oh, yeah, sorry there. Just had to pause real quick. Right as I started this video, my computer said that I was low on battery. So I figure I needed to double check that. But in any case, yes, I got the charger plugged in, and we're just going to keep rolling for a few more minutes, not way longer in this part. But I'm going to start with China. We'll get partway through. In talking about China, obviously, again, you could build entire semesters, probably more than that, on China alone, let alone all the areas around it. We've got, like I said, getting into Vietnam, Thailand. Oh, I didn't even talk about Thailand earlier. All these different places, Korea. But in any case, in Taiwan, all these areas that are around China, we could also dig into. But we're going to talk for now about the ancient roots of China, as the largest kind of country in Asia. Then yeah, we probably ought to talk about it. But after Russia, of course. But it's the largest one after Russia. But in any case, yes, talking about the area of China, Proto-Chinese civilization began about 5000 BC. Anytime you see the word proto, I already mentioned it in this video, Proto-Indo-European. Proto just means pre, right? So the Proto-Chinese civilization, that's just like pre-China civilization, begins by 5000 BC. So by this time, we're already pretty well into the Neolithic in Asia. And originating in the Yellow River Valley, we have our first established dynasties and cities and things, modern civilizations developing in the area of China. So around the Yangtze and the Yellow River, we have the Shang dynasty. This is as big as they get. They rule from about 1600 to nearly 1000 BC, so second millennium. But again, they just show up as the earliest civilization we know of, the most developed one at the earliest time that we know of. They emerge from the Neolithic period. They start the second millennium BC, and this is like kind of ending of the Neolithic. We've gone through the Bronze Age. We're about to get to the Bronze and Iron Ages. But in any case, the Neolithic era ends, and we have very advanced works of jade, lacquer, ivory, precious metals, and of course, bronze. This is what we see here, this late Shang vessel, this cauldron, pretty amazing work in cast and probably some hammered bronze here with lots of intricate detailing and just really high levels of work. Like we talked about before, jade and lacquer both come from this area, this sort of red carved lacquer we looked at in the media section, as well as, the green stone jade. But we're going to focus here mostly on some of the ceramics and metalwork. But in any case, in terms of, and actually we're going to focus on what they were showing. So the earliest motifs that we see form in China in the Shang dynasty are animal imagery. In this case, we call them the Tao Cai. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but the Tao Cai include horned and spiral motifs. They're characteristic Shang decorative motifs that kind of coincide with the animal. So that'll be like an animal head for a knob, but then its body turns into this sort of spiraled repeating motif. This typically, it probably represents communicating with the spirit world through animal guides. Again, yeah, animal imagery is rife in the ancient world, but we see it espoused in these really intricate, really nice works here from the Shang era. And then as the second millennium ends, the Shang are defeated in around 1050 BC, and this brings about 800 years of the Zhao, which, as far as I know, the Zhao, it's really just a word for this like chaotic time of a bunch of different dynasties, kind of all vying for power at the same time. It's sort of feudal for about 800 years. And the state of Qin, it's spelled Qin, but it's actually the root of the name China, the word anyway. But the state of Qin, it united all of China, at least up until that time, under one emperor known as Shi Huangdi. And he kind of unites under the Qin dynasty in 221 BC. Now, there's areas headed towards Transoxiana and the sort of that hook that's in the northwest of China that probably is still not really something you would consider a part of China just yet. So it's not that it's its full expanse, but it's everything that was kind of the main areas of China at this point. But in any case, the most famous artwork out of this time, and maybe one of the most famous ancient artworks from China in general, is the Terracotta Army, built by Shi Huangdi. Now, as far far as we know, like many royals throughout time, Xu Wengdi suffered some sort of mental some mental issues, and towards the end of his life, he was taking like mercury and other types of experimental medicines to try to deal with his hallucinations that didn't necessarily help, and so he had some difficulties in sort of grandeur, like I said, a lot of rulers in the ancient world. But he commissions this terracotta army, which is actually a life-size army of something like, 10,000. I'm sorry, I was checking to see if the number was here, but I think it's something like 10,000 soldiers, including different ranks. So we got cavalry on their horses, we have archers, we have infantry, we have generals, all sort of made out of clay and buried in his tomb. Once again, another just massive hall of like basically grave goods, and just a giant mausoleum that again gives us some insight into the ancient world and some of the greater works that they were working on at this time. And so yeah, he fills it up. These are supposed to be, the army that he will take into the afterlife, or that will protect his tomb, keep it from grave robbers and things. And it's a pretty impressive feat to just get this done. And again, you can see the people here. These terracotta figures are basically life size. It's a pretty impressive. But in any case, Xu Wengdi dies, and I think, yeah, the Qin dynasty only lasts 15 years or so, and after that it gives way to the Han. Now, many ethnic Chinese people, as far as I know, I haven't spoken to a lot of ethnic Chinese people to see where this really lies, but as I understand it, many ethnic Chinese people think of themselves more connected to the Han than the Qin, even though the name comes from Qin. But in any case, maybe they're just pretty much connected in some way. But the Qin ends, Han begins, and during Han rule is when we see the rise of Confucianism and Taoism under what is really a largely like peaceful time in China. Now, of course, they're always dealing with the sort of nomadic invaders from the north, and what will become the Mongols. And I used to know really well the name of the like broader nomadic groups there. But in any case, yeah, it's basically north of China. There's always some nomadic group causing some trouble up there. But in China, they really began to establish settled society laws and rules, and one of the main sort of beliefs that they start to take on is Confucianism. And though Confucianism comes to power centuries after his life, the Han Dynasty makes the teachings of Confucius the official state philosophy. Confucius lived, in the 6th and 5th century BC, and he was a Chinese teacher, editor, politician, and philosopher. He taught these sort of basic beliefs here. I'm showing in the slide. It is a belief system based on the ideas of the right relationships, proper relationships between people. Basically, kind of the idea of doing unto your neighbor, or at least allowing your neighbor to live their life like you want them to let you live yours. Creating good, proper social roles helps create social order. Respecting the family and older generations, veneration for your elders helps establish a settled society. Respecting wisdom and those sort of things. Acting in a morally correct way, again, sort of focusing on being good and being the best that you can becomes, it's like a decision that societies have to make to say, hey, let's actually be good. And then, of course, Confucianism is also big on education. Every individual and in all of broader society should seek to be educated and to know, scholarly ideas. It was established. It helped establish a peaceful and ordered society. The Han, lasted several hundred years, and Confucianism is one of the peaceful ways that this is allowed to happen. Now, Confucian ideas dominate artistic themes for several centuries, even after the Han pass, which, sorry, I'm going to double check, 220 AD. So yeah, 400 years it lasts. And even after that, Confucianism remains like a kind of a common state policy. We see a lot of artwork that actually has here. This one, we see this panel, or sort of, it's almost like a comic, giving admonitions of the instructions to the ladies of the palace. Basically, it's a Tang copy of an artwork done in the Han Dynasty. It's basically like a visual aid for, acting right, having proper manners as a lady of the palace and things like that. And so this art is common for the time. Now, on the spiritual side of things, an answer to Confucianism, we have spiritual matters or the practice of Taoism. So Confucianism is philosophy society for society, and Taoism becomes the spiritual sort of focus for society. Tao means way or path. Sometimes you'll see it spelled with a T. I have the Book of Tao. It's Tao in my house, but we call it, or it basically centers around the flow of the universe, right? That there's energy and movement. I can't help but almost think of it almost like a force or something like that, but that's probably just my modern brain. But in any case, there's just energy and there's flow, and we are subject to it, and we can move through it or move with it, move against it. But this whole idea, it forms the conception of the afterlife, right? That we live, we move through the flow, and then part of the flow is dying and moving on. But also there's a center of Taoism that relates to philosophy, right? And the ideas of how to live your life and how to think about life and reflect on your own life and intellectualism and poetry, right? So being knowledgeable, being artistic, being creative and literary is central to Taoism, and lends itself to Confucianism. This incense burner, this is sort of like a modern thing. We even have incense burners now that sort of manipulate the smoke here. The whole idea of this burner was that when the incense was burning, the sort of undulation and decoration of the burner would be reflected in the sort of flowing smoke as it moved out, kind of like those like dragons you buy at Walmart now, but in a much more sophisticated and worthwhile way. So this is a Han Chinese burner from the Lui Sheng tomb. Now, this is the slide that I'm going to end on for part one. We're going to talk about the Silk Road. So, towards the end of or throughout the Han Dynasty, I guess I should say, emissaries move from the Han China throughout the rest of the world and begin to establish better and better connections. Yeah, the establishment of the Silk Road pretty much goes right along with Han China. Starts in the 200s, reaches like a maximum by 200, or it really is flourishing by 200 AD. BC to AD. In any case, 200 BC to 200 AD. Now, these trade routes are mostly formed by Han Dynasty emissaries. They move across Transoxiana. That's part of why eventually this becomes China, because it's such an important portal to India, to Persia, to Arabia, and then, of course, later on to Europe. Yeah, and they basically expand and establish. There are already trade routes moving this way, but they really come into their full fruition, and of course, they're becoming even greater, even more as we move through the Han Dynasty. But there's also, I think it's worth noting, a sea route for the Silk Road that's also really important. We kind of focus on the overland route, but getting to Europe is essentially required to be done by sea. Now, of course, a lot of it was done via the Greeks and the Mediterranean's Asia Minor societies. But in any case, we see this link all the way pretty much across from, by 200 AD, Europe is still sort of fledgling. And so getting to Rome is pretty much getting to the edge of the world. And then, they're getting there all the way from the Pacific. But in any case, these trade routes connect east with west in the trade of silk, the trade of pottery, the trade of weapons. We have Celts who have gold and cape. The gold cape comes from China, I believe. There's jade from all over. Of course, we now know a lot of Celtic jade came from Italy, but there's still goods from China, from Arabia, from Persia that have made their way into Europe, by ancient times already, and it's mostly due to the trade routes that become the Silk Road. But there's also religion and philosophy making its way across. There's science, there's technology, new technologies and weaponry. But then, of course, there's also diseases and all these things. And, we go through ebbs and flows of, how good it is, what good is spreading, what bad is spreading. But yeah, as we move into the next section, we're going to talk about mainly focusing on the religions and philosophies that spread. But yeah, we know that the art and material culture across the entire Eurasian continent begins to shift by the end of the Han Dynasty. I'm going to end part one right there, and then join you guys again for part two after a while. Thanks.